On today's to-do list, there are two topics. First, we'll define an Elasticache Redis cluster and enable the Lambda function access the cluster. That might seem to be a routine Terraform configuration task, but I expect a bit more effort. The thing is, the Redis cluster we are going to create is bound to a VPC, but the Lambda function presently is defined outside any of my personal VPCs. So next, we are going to delve in VPC, subnet, and security group settings. I ended my last video saying that both AWS Lambda and Elasticache Redis should reside in the same VPC, and the security groups of these resources should allow access from one to another. And that's what I'm gonna do now. I'm gonna create a VPC because I don't want to use the existing one, the default VPC. Instead, I'll create the VPC exactly for my current exercise. And I want to include this VPC, include this Lambda into the VPC, or I would say enable VPC for the Lambda. And let's check how would I do it in Terraform. So now I'm going to go check the Terraform definition for the AWS Lambda resource. So AWS Lambda Terraform resource. These specs should define the way for me to provide the VPC for the Lambda. And here it is, VPC config. I will use it in my Lambda Terraform file, resource definition, but I'm missing something, and what I'm missing is the VPC. And also I miss the subnet, because definitely this definition should be explicitly referring to the subnet this Lambda function belongs to. Therefore, the next step for me is to declare this VPC resource here. Let it be just VPC Terraform. And also I will need a private subnet for my Lambda, and probably Redis will belong to the same private subnet. Let's see. I will need also a security group, but security group I will create later. For now, I need the AWS VPC resource, and let's check if I have it here. Let me be more specific. AWS VPC, do I have it? Yes, this one. The definition initially would be as simple as this. Or maybe I'll use some tags, because actually I want to provide the name for this VPC. And I believe providing the name through the tags is the only way. So I will copy and paste this code here. And it won't be a main VPC. I won't be referring to the main VPC resource in the Terraform. Instead, Quizless VPC. And I'm fine with the default CIDR block. But I'm not sure about the instance tenancy. Not so sure. That's probably it for now. Later on, I'm probably add something here as well. But the one thing is missing is a proper naming here. I will see this name on the VPC page of AWS GUI. And the next thing I need is a private subnet. And as I have the subnet, I also will need a route table. But again, let's start with the subnet. And I believe the subnet should be AWS. Subnet. Again, I should search the page. That's here. Let me name this subnet again Quizless subnet. It will be a private one. because I don't want to expose both Lambda and Redis CLI directly for the user. Instead, I'll be using them internally behind the API gateway. So let it be Quizless private subnet. And I want to use this CIDR block for the subnet, but also I'm afraid a bit that I might have collisions somewhere, or maybe one of the users who will fork the repository will have collisions. So instead of having this data hard-coded, I will go to my variables and define a new variable, and the name would be, I don't know, probably quizless subnet CIDR with this default value. Okay, I can refer to it like variable.quizless_subnet_CIDR. And I also want to specify the availability zone. This availability zone depends on my availability zone that I specify for the whole VPC I'm using. Here and there, let me check the main.tf if I'm specifying yes, my region is here. So I can make the region again, the variable, and this should be probably the top level variable. With this default value, so it will be AWS region. And as well, I will introduce AWS Quizless, or let it be just Quizless subnet availability zone, and it will be your Union Central 1A. Now I'll replace the main Terraform file definition, the region here, this variable AWS region, and let me go back here. I need in this block availability zone. Let me check. How should I name it? Will it be AZ? Yes, it's availability zone. And again, I am getting this value from the variable. It's simple. Nice. What's missing here? Probably I want to define the name for this subnet the same way I defined the name for my AWS VPC resource. And let it be the same, but instead of underscores that are probably prohibited here in the name definition. Oh, I see a typo. I will use dashes. So I created the subnet for the VPC resource I'm introducing. And for this cluster, I also want to provide the root table. Again, I'm checking the root table definition, probably AWS root table. And again, I don't see a reason why it's showing me so many results. Of course, root table might be somewhere, but maybe not with this exact prefix. But never mind. AWS root table, it's here. The naming, okay, it would be Quizless root table. That's better. And for the root table, of course, I'm referring to this very VPC. And I need to define roots, and I'm not sure about using the roots directly here in these root blocks. Not so sure. Let me see. I'll add this data later on, but for now, I'll just delete it and rename the Quizless root table from example to this. Okay, this is much better. Let me check the documentation again. And I see interesting section next to the root table, and this is the root table association. So I'm gonna connect this private subnet and the root table into a single record. And this single record will be this one. I will just replace this AWS subnet foo to AWS subnet, Quizless private subnet. And the root table is this name. And it would be Quizless something, probably Quizless association. Cool. Now I have both the VPC. That's not that won't be a default one any longer for all the resources I'm placing. For the resources that belongs to the VPC, because let's see here, S3 definitely does not belong to the VPC. API gateway probably does, but let's see. And as I have the root table, as I have the private subnet, I can now reuse this private subnet. I can go back to the Lambda function and refer to the private subnet here, Quizless private subnet. But something is still missing, and this is security group ID. I have to create the security group. And as for the security group, if I'm not mistaken, I'll be clearly defining what ingress and out and egress traffic I'm allowing. So my actions in the security group would be to allow something to allow CIDR block and ports for my specific resources, namely for my Lambda. Let's see how do I achieve this. Now I'm going to check that documentation again, and it will be probably again the same prefix, but security group. That's it. The security group definition is relatively big. It includes both the ingress and the egress filtering rules, and that's all I need probably. I can start modifying this from the name, and it's a Quizless Lambda security group. I'm a bit inconsistent with naming, mostly because I'm trying to do coding and explaining at the same time, and my mind is flowing, rambling from one stop to another. So I see I have Lambda S3 policy, and here it's Quizless Lambda S3 policy. I could spend some time fixing these naming issues and making my code look nicer, but not for now. For this particular exercise, mm, I believe it would be okay. Again, the name of the security group, I can use this name here, or I can use the name here as a separate argument in two places. I don't know the reason why do we have this name both in the name attribute and one more time in the text. So I would just copy it from one place to another. And the next important thing is the VPC ID, and this is Quizless VPC, not a main one, we don't have this. And the description is, let's say it's allowing limited inbound traffic and unlimited egress traffic. That's fine. Now we refer to the VPC, and we should specify our ingress traffic rules. First, that's not about TLS. I'm not sure now how would my Lambda communicate to the API gateway, but let's just assume this is the default port 80. I have too many descriptions already. And the protocol is probably still TCP, though it's a high-level protocol, HTTP, but again, the basis is the same. Let's see if it works. And I need also the CIDR block, and this block might be different, not so sure. I will probably reuse the security group that I defined here, CIDR block. Might be I should be more specific here, but again, we'll try to run it and we'll see. And I don't need any IPv6 traffic. That's it for the ingress, and the egress traffic is the one that's going from the Lambda function towards Redis. And this elastic cache Redis resource probably is limited to port 6379. Not so sure. But again, I believe all my egress traffic from this Lambda function, of course, it will be limited to the internal private subnet, but I believe all this traffic is safe. But for now, let me try to define to limit it to just the Redis port. And now that's it. We defined the security group for our Lambda function. And this security group refers to the private subnet, at least here by the CIDR block. I'm not so sure, but I hope it will work. And refers as well to the VPC. And we provided this VPC for the Lambda function here, not the VPC, but subnet ID. And the security group, yep, we can use this security group here in the VPC configuration of our Lambda function. But first and foremost, we are creating the new VPC. And I'm gonna run this configuration. Ideally, my Lambda will still be functioning, nothing bad will happen, but we won't see any real benefit from all these modifications until we introduce the Elastic Cache Redis resource. Now let's run the configuration. That's interesting. A managed resource AWS VPC main. Uh, okay, where do I have it? Yes, copy pasting often result with errors like this. My VPC is creating, I'll check it soon, but I have an error here. Oh, okay. I don't want to overcomplicate the things. and I don't wanna introduce specific checks for the protocol because probably it's TCP, but I'm not so sure. Let me just have this port equals to 0 in both places. Okay, now it's Lambda that's being created, and soon we'll be able to check it with the same payload, with the same request to get the quiz topics. But again, the process hasn't still finished yet. For some reason now it takes much time to deploy. Maybe providing the VPC for the Lambda is a longer process, is a more complex one when create a Lambda, let's say global AWS VPC enabled Lambda. Interesting. Let me pause the recording. It took 5 minutes and now I see this error. And the execution role of my Lambda does not have permissions for this particular call. So let me see, this role is not enough in my case. This means I want to modify my Lambda, not exactly the Lambda, but probably I will create another policy, not so sure for the Lambda, that will enable this create network interface action. So I need a policy for this action for the Lambda. I will try Google it. What policy I need? This one. Let me create first this policy, as we did already here, Lambda S3 policy. And this one is Lambda network policy. And let me check how did I define this policy for Lambda here. Probably I need two resources. First, the policy itself, and second, the policy attachment. So I would copy them both. And this is Lambda network policy. Oh, so many errors, typos. I don't need this bucket. So this will be just file, not a template file. And the policy attachment is simple. Now I start my deployment again and hope this time it won't be so long and it will create and VPC enable my Lambda. Again, I'll pause the recording. Or maybe not, because right now I see something's going on. Policy is being created. If the Lambda won't be updated, if the Lambda is not updated, that means the whole process shouldn't take too long. But no, it is updating. Okay, pause. It actually took longer than I expected, and I didn't record some stuff that I added to the role, to the AIM user that I use for my Terraform configuration that I specified in the profile settings of the Terraform here. If you remember, for the profile, I have the section in my AWS slash configuration file. And here in the configuration file, I have both access key and the secret. So I'm referring to the user. Let's check I am to the Terraform special user. And this user belongs to the developer group. And the developers group, now it needed one more permission. Initially, it was administrator access policy attached to the group. But additionally, I had to add this system administrator policy to be able to complete the operation. Because before I used to get this error, let me show it. The error was insufficient role permissions. So this does not mean that my Lambda role or any other resource I declared in my Terraform files is missing the required permissions. No, that's only about my Terraform profile and my user that I'm referring to while deploying this configuration. But now it's done, and I can go and check what VPC I have now. It should be a new Quizless VPC. And let's check, do I have subnets here? This is the CID we defined for the VPC. And I should have a root table, this one. This root table is associated with Quizless private subnet. That's okay, but nothing changed so far about my AWS Lambda. Again, I'm not expecting that this Lambda function has something new. I still want to check if it works and if my payload here still can be processed with my Lambda. I will gonna test it, and I will gonna provide this payload again here, event.json, and press test. Please let it be green. It's taken too much time, so now I'm not so sure the execution will be. Yes, I see. Task timed out. That's something new. Might be I'm missing something now in my AWS Lambda configuration, or might be it cannot check. Oh yes, I see the problem now. It cannot access the S3 resource because S3 is a global resource, and I am accessing it now from the Lambda. Before, my Lambda used to belong to AWS Global VPC, and it automatically was allowed to access S3. But now this way it's not allowed any longer. And probably I need an internet gateway to access S3 from Lambda. And let's again start from Googling. Allow VPC enabled Lambda, access S3. I need a gateway, internet gateway probably. No clue so far. I need a gateway VPC endpoint, probably. Let me check. Now I want to access S3 from EC2, no, just from VPC. and I need a gateway endpoint. And let me check how do I define gateway VPC endpoint in Terraform for enable my Lambda access to S3. Again, let's check what exactly the VPC endpoint is. The gateway VPC endpoint, AWS gateway endpoint. Oh, it's a bit too broad, but let's see. It provides reliable connectivity to S3 without requiring an internet gateway or net device for your VPC. So from my VPC, I finally will be able to access to reach out to the S3 resource, providing I have this gateway. And this gateway should be referred to from the root table. So let me check what's inside this definition for the AWS VPC endpoint. This resource at the first glance looks simple, but for now I don't see where I can refer from the AWS VPC endpoint to the root table, or probably vice versa, from the root table to the VPC endpoint. Okay, at least I need to be a bit more specific here, because I don't need any endpoint. I need a VPC endpoint. I need a, gateway endpoint. Let me make a bit more specific query. This one, I believe, type gateway. Yes, this one, I believe, will enable. Let's see. My accessing S3 bucket with the quiz data from the Lambda. Probably it's here VPC endpoint type. Okay. Let's reuse this simple definition. Where should I create it? Probably a separate file. I might need more resources here for this VPC endpoint. .tf. Let me name it as usual. And I definitely need my default VPC, not a default, but the new one here. And the service name, it consists of com, Amazon, AWS, and the region. But the region is something different. I already have this var region. Let me check how do I call it. AWS region. And I need this $sign. Nice. I also need to specify this VPC endpoint type. It should be gateway starting from the capital. Oh, it's uncomfortable to copy and paste this key here, but I'll manage. This is gateway. But as soon as I remember, I need also to specify the root table for my AWS VPC endpoint resource. Let me be again more specific. It's Terraform, AWS VPC endpoint, root table, or maybe root underscore table, not so sure. Okay, let me run this query again. Root table. There is an extra resource to associate these two resources, AWS VPC endpoint and the root table. Where do I have this root table? Somewhere here in VPC. Yes. And now this would be Quizless VPC endpoint root table. I hope that my root table will allow all the egress traffic for S3 from AWS Lambda. And now I want to deploy as I did many times before, and I pause the recording. No, something went wrong. This managed resource, Quizless VPC endpoint, is missing. I haven't declared it yet. That's weird. It's here. AWS VPC endpoint. Yes, this is the right one. Again, might be I should include this depends on section and list this resource here. I believed it would be explicit, it would be implicitly defined, and I don't have to provide this depend on argument. Depends on didn't help. Managed resource has not been declared. No, that does not belong to the data. Interesting. It's line number 12. Let me check how I define depends on in Terraform. Hmm. Seems like, oh, why, why this is declared as data? This is a problem. I copied it from somewhere in the way it shouldn't be declared here. It's not a data, it's a resource I declare. Now I will pause my deployment because it probably again will try to deploy Lambda and it takes time. Oh no, actually it was fast enough. And should I see my API, my VPC endpoint, gateway endpoint somewhere on the list? Okay, let me define it as an endpoint. Yes, this is the VPC feature. It should be somewhere here. Yes, here is my endpoint. It leads to this root table. And I'm gonna repeat my test. I'm gonna test it again. And let's see, it's green and the response is correct. So what we did so far, we enabled this Lambda for the VPC, and also the Lambda function now will able to access the Redis resource, providing we also include these Elastic Cache Redis in the same VPC and set up the network and set up the security group for the Redis. Let's do this. Redis is just one of the options, and generally it's AWS Elastic Cache. Elastic Cache. Oh, I believe that's Elastic Cache cluster. And again, this is a bit too broad. I want to create a Redis cluster, and I want to also specify the subnet for my cluster and the security group that I will create later, the same way I created the security group for my Lambda function. But there are too many options for my Redis resource, so I want to Google it a bit. Let's see an example configuration. I hope it will be a bit easier to start in with something. Okay, there are too many arguments here that I'm not sure about the purpose of. Okay, cluster mode, I probably won't need this, but again, let's copy, paste, and then decide on what we need and what we don't need. Let it be a separate module. Oh, sorry, that's a replication group. I don't need a replication group. I need just a cluster. Let me go back and check. Is there a sample and simple configuration for the, yes, this is one. This is the one for the Redis Elastic Cache resource. And this cluster is not longer example, but instead the quiz cluster. And the engine is Redis, but the node type is not the one I'm going to use because M for large is definitely something expensive. And for my experiments, I need the simplest and the cheapest one. So I'm going to check the cheapest node type for the Redis cluster, AWS, cheapest Redis cluster, node type. There is a great table, but that's a bit on the big side. I used to refer to the T2 micro probably with with ECS, with EC2. There is something strange about this resource type. For instance, there is cache T1 micro, and this cache T1 micro is actually more expensive than general purpose one. And the least expensive one is T4G micro. It's really small, but interesting. I'm not sure what means unavailable because this price is Redis reserved costs. Okay, affected hourly rate and on demand cost. This probably means I cannot reserve this instance. I don't have to reserve it. Still, probably this one option is the cheapest, but I'm not sure about T4, never used it. So I will go with this option. And num cache nodes again, let it be one. I believe this group name is okay for me, and the engine version okay as well. So this cluster configuration is probably complete, but I have to include this cluster, this Redis cluster in my VPC and make my Lambda function accessing this Redis cluster without extra effort. My next query will be how to include this AWS Elastic Cache cluster in VPC subnet in Terraform. And here I see Elastic Cache subnet group. Okay. I'm not sure how I will use this subnet group in my Redis configuration, but let's see. Oh, I should go back to AWS Elastic Cache cluster. What options do I have here? Subnet group name. This is the one I will probably use, but before I should define this subnet group. And this looks simple. Let it be Elastic Cache subnet group. The name will be the same, but dashes instead of underscores. And the subnet ID, I will reuse the same subnet I used for Lambda function also. And this is my quiz this private subnet. Now I'm gonna provide this subnet group name here. This is the resource type. This is the resource name. And probably I need the name. Okay. But I haven't finished yet, and now I need to define the security group the way I did it for my Lambda function. And I will start from simply copying and pasting the security group for the Lambda function and including this security group here. Don't forget to rename it. It's not Lambda, but Elastic Cache. And the name is, okay, it will be simply Redis. Let it be Redis here as well. Let's decide on the ingress traffic. I believe the ingress is 6379. I also believe the protocol is TCP. It might, no, it shouldn't be UDP. It shouldn't be something secure like TLS. I believe I'm good with TCP protocol here. And the egress, again, for now, I don't care where my Redis cluster would reroute his requests, his responses. So any addresses are allowed in the egress session. Now I'm okay with this resource definition. I just have to associate my security group and the Elastic Cache cluster. Probably I will do it the same way I did before. Yes, it's security group names. Oh, and the security group names is a simple association. At least it's supposed to be. Like we did with the subgroup name, we just refer to this resource and to the name of the resource. Again, should I use the security group names? I better prefer the security group IDs. I'm not sure if the same works for the subnet. Now I see only the subnet name, but for the security groups, I have the IDs option. Let it be security group ID. And this is it, but I already have Redis somewhere in my Lambda function logic. And I'm accessing this Redis, let me check the settings, by the localhost address. Localhost address is probably inappropriate. I should refer to something else, but before referring to actual address of my Redis resource, I should find this output here. Let me check how do I get the address ID to substitute the default variable in the Lambda definition. My Lambda already has couple definitions for the storage type and for the bucket name, and the one for the Redis host. And probably I will be referring to my Redis cluster here. This is the type of the resource. Now I need the resource name, and I need the ID. I need the identifier of this, the address of this quiz cluster I am creating. Let me Google how do I get for this resource, get Redis cluster ID and the resource type. No, not the ID by IP. Constantly messing this too. Okay, this is data addresses. I'm not sure if it works for me. Let's see. At least let's try this variable and we'll see it in the configuration of our Lambda function. I might use something like this, not sure. But now my Redis cluster is configured and my Lambda got updated a bit. So let's run and check how it works. And at least I want to see my Redis cluster running. I believe, oh, the object has no argument, nested block, or exported attribute, name it others. Yes, my request was a bad one. No, I'm desperately searching for a solution. My Google skills are not serving me well. Again, what do I have here? In the Redis cluster specification, I have cluster address. Oh, that's about memcache, not about Redis. I have cache nodes, and each node object includes ID and address and the port. That's nice. Probably I could use cache nodes here. I'm not sure about the first one. It's a list and address. Okay, hope it will work. Fingers crossed. What resource? Something's not right. Yeah, glitches from my previous attempt. Let me clean it. This time it works, and let me show you how I managed to deal with the error I had previously. And the error was about the resource that was already existing. And what I did, I imported this existing resource to the configuration to this Elasticache subnet group. So I executed this Terraform import command for this resource, and I provided the identifier of the existing resource. And this command imported this resource into the TF state file. So my second command was to actually apply the configuration, and it took probably something about 8 seconds totally, maybe a bit more, but finally my configuration is deployed. And now that I defined the subnet group, the security group, and also I defined the, let's check the Lambda function definition, the Redis host for the Lambda function definition. I'm just gonna go and check the configuration for the Redis host environment variables. Maybe that's old value. Let me refresh it. Now it looks fine. I believe that's it. That's the address. I don't need the port. I believe the port is the default one, 6379. But if it's not, I can easily add this Redis underscore port, and the same way I did it here, I will take the first cache node. Again, we have just one cache node. Let me check my Redis definition. Yes, just one. And I will use the port here. But that's not needed. I truly hope my Lambda will work with the new request I'm gonna provide. And the new request is something about the starting the quiz. Probably that's the first command. That's the second command we implemented. And okay, let it be an array. The requested operation is quiz start. Here I actually need some payload. Let me check what the payload is. I have it somewhere here in the same README. Oh, and I actually need headers. Here is the payload. I just have to again escape it. Escape every single quote. As it's a string, not a JSON, I don't want to break this line in parts, so it will be a long line. But I also need headers, probably. Or maybe I don't, because again, the payload is already here in the body, and that's up to the gateway, to the API gateway to parse my response and to parse my request and to provide my Lambda function with data in the event argument. So let's check my quotes in the payload. I have two curly braces on the right side and two on the left side. Hope it will work. Now I'm gonna test my Lambda function. No, it failed. But at least I have the error message. This quiz was not found. The identifier is wrong. That's fine. Oh, I see now the return value quiz wasn't found. I should fix it because it actually contains all the quiz data. Why don't I see it? That's weird. Might be, oh, that's even more weird. Let me check the quiz command implementation. Quiz manager. Yep, just my search don't work. It doesn't work for the reason I don't know, but I don't have to print all the quizzes here. Instead, I will print it differently, like I'll be joining by the command the extra space. I will use list comprehension. And from the quiz, what I need is ID. Yes, this is about ID. So what's wrong? Why is it highlighted? Oh, I missed the join. Okay. Next time I will redeploy my Lambda function. But for now, I want to just check it and go to the next topic. So I'm going to replace my payload with this ID that actually exists. The first one will do. And I have the payload to try again. And test. Now it worked like a charm. My quiz logic in the Lambda function is actually completed, and I can go on and introduce the API gateway. And the next stop is the API gateway first, and second, the integration for the API gateway to enable my frontend to access the API and to implement the quiz logic from the server side to the client side. Now I'd like to be a bit more specific here because our actual configuration is much more complex when we see on the board. We have also VPC, we have also security groups, root table, and VPC endpoint. And now that it's getting complex, I want to provide you with the diagram showing all the resources and all the dependencies we created so far. Because we'll introduce one more resource at least, it will be API gateway. But I'll leave it for the next video.